Hey everyone! You know all those recent headlines about turbulence? Well, we're diving into that today to give you a clearer picture.
Yeah, put those worries to rest.
We'll be using Captain James's document Air Turbulence as our guide for this deep dive.
You know, those news stories might make you think every flight's a roller coaster ride.
Yeah, it did feel that way for a while.
With severe turbulence, it's actually incredibly rare.
Okay, but like how rare are we talking? Like once in a blue moon rare?
Pretty much. The last turbulence-related fatality on a U.S. airline was way back in 1997.
Wow, 1997, that's almost 30 years ago.
Exactly. And think about all the flights since
It
then.
makes you realize it's really not that common.
It puts things into perspective. Flying is statistically one of the safest ways to travel. But any turbulence can be unnerving if you're not prepared.
Okay, so that brings up a good point. Seatbelts.
Ah, yes, the trusty seatbelt.
We all know about takeoff and landing. But what about when that seatbelt sign is off? If it's smooth sailing, does it really matter?
That's where things get a little tricky. Remember how we said severe turbulence is rare but unpredictable?
Right, like a pop quiz you didn't study for.
Exactly. So wearing your seatbelt whenever you're seated, that's your best defense. It's all about minimizing that risk.
So like the old saying, better safe than sorry.
Exactly. Think about it. Pilots, they know the skies better than anyone.
True, they're the pros.
And you know what? They always wear their seatbelts in the cockpit. And it's not because they're expecting turbulence on every single flight. It's about being ready for anything.
Makes sense. If the pilots are always buckled up, probably a good idea for the rest of us to follow their lead.
Right, they understand those crazy weather patterns and how unpredictable things can get.
Their actions speak louder than words, I
Huh.
guess. So we're talking about making it a habit. Buckle up as soon as you sit down, even if that seatbelt sign is off.
Exactly. That simple action could make all the difference if you hit some unexpected bumps.
Got it. Buckle up, stay safe.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've covered the rarity of severe turbulence.
And the importance of always wearing those seatbelts.
Now let's dig into some real-world examples of turbulence and what happens when things get rough.
Sounds good. Let's take a look at some specific incidents that Captain James highlights in his document.
Perfect. Let's get into it.
So first up, we've got Singapore Airlines Flight 321. This one happened earlier this year in June.
Okay, I remember hearing about this one. It was all over the news.
Yeah, it was a pretty intense situation. The flight encountered severe clear air turbulence over the South China Sea.
Clear air turbulence. That sounds scary. It's like it comes out of nowhere.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's tough to predict, and it can catch you off guard.
So what happened on this flight?
Well, it was about 90 minutes into the flight. They were cruising at 39,000 feet.
So pretty high up.
Yeah, and suddenly, bam, they hit this really rough patch of air.
Ouch.
Yeah, some passengers and crew members were injured. They even had to divert the flight to Singapore to get medical attention.
Wow, that sounds pretty serious.
It was. And this wasn't just a minor bump. It was severe turbulence, the kind that can really toss you around the cabin.
Definitely makes you appreciate that seatbelt even more.
Absolutely. Now, the next incident Captain James talks about is Qatar Airways Flight 17.
Okay, so what happened on this flight?
This one took place in February of this year, and it was flying from Washington, D.C. to Doha, Qatar.
Got a long-haul flight.
Yeah, they were about 7 hours into the flight over the North Atlantic when they encountered moderate turbulence.
Moderate? Okay, so not as severe as a Singapore Airlines flight.
Right, but still enough to cause some concern.
Yeah.
The interesting thing about this incident is that there were multiple reports of injuries.
Oh, wow. Even with moderate turbulence.
Yeah, it highlights that even milder forms of turbulence can pose a risk if you're not prepared.
Okay, so 2 incidents so far. Both happened earlier this year. Both involved injuries.
Exactly, and these are just a couple of examples. Captain James goes on to detail several other incidents.
It really drives home the point that turbulence is something we need to take seriously.
Absolutely, you just never know when those bumpy skies might surprise you.
All right, so we've talked about those recent events. Now let's go back in time a bit.
Back to the history books.
Exactly. Captain James mentions the last known turbulence fatality on a U.S. carrier. It's back in 1997 on United Airlines Flight 826.
Oh, yeah. That was a tragic incident. It happened over the Pacific Ocean.
What exactly happened?
Well, the flight encountered severe clear air turbulence again, and unfortunately, one passenger wasn't wearing a seatbelt.
Oh, no.
Yeah, she was thrown from her seat and sustained fatal injuries.
That's heartbreaking. It really underscores the importance of that seatbelt.
It does. It's a stark reminder that even though severe turbulence is rare, the consequences can be devastating if you're not properly secured.
Absolutely. So it seems like the key takeaway here is that whether it's 1997 or 2024, that seatbelt is your best friend when you're in the air.
Couldn't agree more. It's that simple action that can truly make all the difference in those unexpected moments.
Okay, so we've covered the importance of seatbelts and the fact that even moderate turbulence can cause problems.
Right. And we've looked at some pretty impactful examples.
Now I'm curious about the bigger picture. What role does climate change play in all of this?
Ah, yes, the climate change question. It's a hot topic these days, and for good reason.
I've heard it could lead to more turbulence in the future. Is that something we should be worried about?
That's what a lot of people are asking, and it's a valid concern. Let's break it down.
Please do. I'm all ears.
So Captain James talks about clear air turbulence, or CCAT, in his document.
Yeah.
Remember, that's the one that can seemingly come out of nowhere.
Yeah, the invisible turbulence.
Yeah.
That's a bit unsettling.
It can be. Imagine cruising through clear skies, no storms in sight, and bam, you hit this rough patch of air.
Not exactly how I want to spend my flight.
I hear ya. And the thing is, climate change might be making CCAT more frequent.
Okay, so how does that work?
Well, as global temperatures rise, those jet streams, those fast-flowing air currents high in the atmosphere, they're expected to get stronger and potentially more erratic.
And stronger jet streams mean more potential for sea.
Exactly. It's like stirring a pot of water. The faster you stir, the more chaotic those currents become.
It's like a turbulent soup.
Pretty much. And there's research to back this up. The University of Reading found that severe CAT over the North Atlantic has increased by a whopping 55% between 1979 and 2020.
55%? That's significant.
It is. It's definitely something to keep an eye on.
So are we destined for bumpier flights in the future?
Not necessarily. While climate change presents challenges, the aviation industry is always evolving to address them.
So what are they doing to combat this potential increase in turbulence?
Well, they're focusing on two main areas: policy changes and technological advancements.
Let's start with policy changes. What are we talking about here?
So after that Singapore Airlines flight we talked about earlier encountered severe CPAT, the airline implemented a new policy requiring flight attendants to halt all food and beverage service whenever the seatbelt sign is on.
Oh, wow. So no more drinks or snacks when that sign is illuminated.
Exactly. It's all about minimizing the risk of anyone being out of their seat when turbulence hits.
Smart move.
And other airlines are taking note. They're reviewing their own policies, looking at ways to enhance safety procedures given these changing conditions.
So it sounds like they're taking this seriously and adapting to the potential challenges of a changing climate.
Absolutely. They're staying proactive, which is great.
Okay, what about the technology side? What's happening there?
This is where things get exciting. There have been some incredible advancements in weather prediction and radar technology.
Like what specifically?
Well, one example is the multi-scan threat track radar developed by Collins Aerospace. It's a game changer for pilots because it can scan the atmosphere up to 320 miles in front of the plane.
Wow, that's like seeing into the future of the flight path.
Pretty much. This radar can detect not only storms, but also those subtle shifts in wind speed and direction that can indicate sea day.
So it gives them a heads up about potential turbulence, even if it's invisible to the naked eye.
Exactly. And with that information, they can adjust their course or altitude to minimize the impact for passengers.
So they can kind of steer clear of the rough stuff?
Exactly. And they can even share this data with other aircraft and air traffic control, creating a network of awareness to enhance safety for everyone.
That's incredible. So even though climate change might create more turbulence, we've got some pretty impressive technology on our side to help us navigate those bumpy skies.
Exactly. It's a constant evolution, but the aviation industry is committed to staying ahead of the curve and ensuring that flying remains as safe and comfortable as possible.
That's reassuring to hear.
Yeah.
So even with those headlines about turbulence and climate change,
We're in good hands.
exactly. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about the human factor. How airlines and passengers are responding to this evolving landscape of turbulence.
Sounds good. Let's dive into that.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about turbulence and its potential increase due to climate change.
Right. It's a topic that's been getting a lot of attention lately.
But beyond the science and the technology, I'm curious about the human element. How are airlines and passengers responding to this evolving landscape of turbulence?
That's a great question. Because at the end of the day, it's the people who are most affected by these changes.
Exactly. So let's start with airlines. How are they adapting their operations and policies?
Well, as we mentioned earlier, they're taking steps to enhance safety protocols, like that new policy from Singapore Airlines about halting food and beverage service when the seatbelt sign is on.
Right. That seems like a common sense approach.
It is. And it's likely we'll see more airlines adopting similar measures in the future.
It makes sense to be proactive rather than reactive.
Exactly. And beyond those specific policies, airlines are also investing heavily in pilot training and education, specifically around turbulence awareness and mitigation strategies.
So they're equipping their pilots with the knowledge and skills to handle these situations effectively.
Precisely. They're running simulations, practicing different scenarios, and staying up to date on the latest research and technologies.
It's like they're constantly training for the Turbulence Olympics.
Haha, something like that. But in all seriousness, they're taking this very seriously because they understand the importance of passenger safety and confidence.
Right. And speaking of passengers, how are they reacting to all of this?
Well, it's a mixed bag.
Yeah.
Some people are understandably anxious, especially after seeing those news headlines.
It's natural to feel a bit apprehensive when you're flying and turbulence is involved.
Absolutely. And for some passengers, it might even trigger a fear of flying or make existing anxieties worse.
So what can those passengers do to manage those feelings?
Well, first and foremost, knowledge is power. The more you understand about turbulence, the less scary it becomes.
So doing your research, like listening to this deep dive, is a good start?
Exactly. Understanding the science behind turbulence, its different categories, and the safety measures in place can help alleviate some of that anxiety.
It's like knowing what to expect and how to handle it.
Precisely. And there are also practical tips that passengers can follow to feel more comfortable during a flight.
Like what?
Well, choosing a seat over the wings can often result in a smoother ride.
Really? Why is that?
It's because the wings provide more stability and lift, so you're less likely to feel those bumps as intensely.
That's good to know. Any other tips?
Staying hydrated and avoiding caffeine and alcohol can also help minimize the effects of turbulence.
Interesting. How so?
Well, dehydration can make you more susceptible to motion sickness, and caffeine and alcohol can increase anxiety and make you more sensitive to those bumps and shakes.
So it's all about staying calm and hydrated.
Exactly. And if you're feeling particularly anxious during a flight, don't hesitate to talk to a flight attendant.
They're there to help, right?
Absolutely. They're trained to handle these situations, and they can offer reassurance, support, and even practical tips to help you feel more at ease.
So it sounds like communication is key.
It is both between airlines and between passengers and the flight crew.
It's all about working together to create a safer and more comfortable flying experience.
Exactly. Now, before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to touch on a crucial point that Captain James emphasizes in his document.
Okay,
He talks about the importance of flight attendant safety. They're often the unsung heroes of the skies.
Absolutely. They're the ones who keep us comfortable and safe during our flights.
Exactly. And they face unique risks, especially when it comes to turbulence.
Right, because they're often up and about serving passengers.
Precisely. They're more likely to be out of their jump seats when those unexpected bumps hit.
And Captain Jay's mentioned some pretty sobering statistics about flight attendant injuries related to turbulence.
He does. He points out that between 2009 and 2021, over 160 people were hospitalized due to turbulence-related injuries, and the majority of them were flight attendants.
Wow, that's a stark reminder of the dangers they face.
It is, and it highlights the importance of airlines taking steps to protect their crew members.
So what can be done to improve flight attendant safety?
While one key measure is better training and education specifically on turbulence awareness and how to react in those situations.
So equipping them with the knowledge and skills to stay safe.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And airlines can also implement stricter policies around when flight attendants are allowed to be out of their seats.
Like limiting service during times of potential turbulence.
Precisely. It's all about minimizing their exposure to those risks.
It sounds like there's a lot that can be done to make flying safer for everyone involved.
Absolutely. And it's an ongoing effort. As we learn more about turbulence and its impacts, both airlines and passengers need to adapt and work together to create a safer, more comfortable flying experience for all.
Well said. So as we wrap up this deep dive into turbulence,
Let's leave our listeners with a few key takeaways.
great idea. What are the most important things for them to remember?
First and foremost, turbulence is a natural part of flying.
It's like bumps in the road. It's
Yeah.
just part of the journey.
Exactly. And while it can be unsettling, it's important to remember that aircraft are designed to withstand even severe turbulence.
So they're built to handle those bumps and shakes.
Absolutely. And second, always, always, always wear your seatbelt whenever you're seated on a plane.
It's the simplest yet most effective way to protect yourself.
Couldn't agree more. It's your best defense against those unexpected bumps.
And third, if you're feeling anxious about turbulence, remember that knowledge is power.
Exactly. Do your research, understand the science, and talk to your doctor or a mental health professional if you have concerns about fear of flying.
And remember, those flight attendants, They're there to help.
Absolutely. Don't hesitate to reach out to them if you're feeling uneasy during a flight.
Great advice. So to sum it all up, turbulence is a fact of life when it comes to flying.
But it's manageable, and the aviation industry is constantly working to improve safety and minimize its impact.
So buckle up, relax, and enjoy the ride.
Safe travels, everyone.
And that concludes our deep dive into turbulence. We hope you found it informative and reassuring.
Thanks for joining us.
We'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration of the world around us.
Until then, stay curious.
And keep exploring.
And it's not just about those really bad incidents. Even with moderate turbulence, which is a bit more common, your seatbelt can stop you from getting tossed around or even hitting your head.
Yeah, that's true. I've definitely felt myself lift up a little during some flights. Not a great feeling.
Yeah, exactly. Imagine trying to get out of your seat during one of those moments. Like to grab something from the overhead bin.
Oh yeah, that's a recipe for disaster.
Not good. So even if those really bad cases of turbulence are rare, it just makes sense to wear your seatbelt all the time, just from a safety standpoint.
Right. Better safe than sorry.
Exactly. And Captain James, he actually mentions some interesting stats in his document. He says that over 1/3 of all U.S. airline incidents between 2009 and 2018 involved turbulence.
Wow, 1/3. That's a lot more than I would have thought. But were those mostly those really severe cases?
Actually, most of them were less severe, but they still resulted in injuries, some of them pretty serious.
So even if it's not the kind of turbulence that makes the news, it can still be dangerous if you're not buckled up.
Exactly. And it's not just passengers who are at risk. Flight attendants, they're particularly vulnerable.
Oh, right, because they're always moving around the cabin.
Exactly. They're often out of their seats when turbulence hits. And Captain James mentions that between 2009 and 2021, over 160 people were hospitalized because of turbulence-related injuries, and most of them were flight attendants.
Wow. That's a scary thought.
Yeah.
It really shows how important those safety measures are, not just for passengers, but for the crew, too.
Absolutely. It shows that turbulence, even the milder forms, can be unpredictable. You just never know.
Okay, so we've established that seatbelts are super important even when everything seems calm. But what about climate change? I've heard that it could lead to more turbulence in the future. Is that something we should be worried about?
That's a question a lot of people have. And it's true that climate change is affecting weather patterns, including those high-altitude winds that cause turbulence.
So more heat, more turbulence. That's not great news for frequent flyers like me.
I hear you. But before you cancel all your trips, let's look at what's actually happening. Captain James talks about clear air turbulence, or C, in his document.
CT. That sounds ominous.
It can be, especially because it's often invisible to pilots and radar. Imagine flying through perfectly clear skies, not a storm in sight, and suddenly you hit this rough patch of air. That's CAT.
So that sounds like the unpredictable turbulence we were just talking about, and climate change could make it more common.
That's what some studies suggest. As global temperatures rise jet streams, those fast-flowing air currents high in the atmosphere, they're expected to become stronger and maybe more erratic.
And stronger jet streams mean more sake.
Exactly. It's like stirring a pot of water. The faster you stir, the more chaotic the currents become. And there's research from the University of Reading that shows severe CAT over the North Atlantic has already increased by 55% between 1979 and 2020.
Wow, 55%. That's a huge jump.
Ugh.
So are we just stuck with bumpier flights in the future?
Not necessarily. While climate change does present challenges, the aviation industry is constantly evolving to address them.
So what are they doing to combat this potential increase in turbulence?
There are two main things they're focusing on: policy changes and technological advancements. Let's start with policies.
Okay, what kind of policy changes?
Well, after that Singapore Airlines flight we talked about encountered severe CKIP, they put in place a new policy requiring flight attendants to stop all food and beverage service whenever the seatbelt sign is on.
That makes sense. It's all about making sure everyone is in their seat when turbulence hits.
Exactly. And other airlines are also looking at their policies. They're trying to figure out ways to improve safety procedures because of these changing conditions.
So it sounds like they're taking this seriously and adapting to the potential challenges of a changing climate.
Absolutely. They're being proactive, which is a good thing.
What about the technology side? What's happening there?
That's where things get really interesting. There have been some incredible advancements in weather prediction and radar technology.
Tell me more. What kind of technology?
Well, for example, there's the multi-stand threat track radar developed by Collins Aerospace. It's a game changer for pilots because it can scan the atmosphere up to 320 miles in front of the plane.
Wow, that's amazing. They can see what's coming.
This radar can detect not just storms, but also those subtle shifts in wind speed and direction that can signal CKATE.
So it gives them a heads up about potential turbulence even if they can't see it.
Exactly. And with that information, they can adjust their course or altitude to minimize the impact on passengers.
So they can avoid the rough patches.
Precisely. And they can even share this data with other aircraft and air traffic control, creating a network of awareness to improve safety for everyone.
That's awesome. So even though climate change might create more turbulence, we've got some pretty impressive technology on our side to help us navigate those bumpy skies.
Exactly. It's a constant back and forth. But the aviation industry is committed to staying ahead of the curve and making sure that flying stays as safe and comfortable as possible.
Okay, so it sounds like even with the possibility of more turbulence because of climate change, we've got some pretty impressive technology and policies in place.
Exactly. And remember, turbulence, even that CT we talked about, it's just one factor that pilots and airlines have to think about when they're planning a flight.
Right. They're trained to deal with all kinds of things. Weather conditions, mechanical issues, all sorts of unexpected situations.
They're constantly monitoring things and making adjustments to make sure the journey is safe and smooth.
And that brings us back to our main point today. Always wear your seatbelt when you're sitting on a plane, even if everything seems calm and the seatbelt sign is off.
It's that extra layer of protection, just in case something unexpected happens.
Exactly. Being proactive rather than reactive.
And remember those pilots? They're always buckled up in the cockpit.
They wouldn't do it if it wasn't important.
They know how important safety is, and they lead by example.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into turbulence, let's leave our listeners with a sense of perspective. Yes, turbulence can be unsettling, but flying is still one of the safest ways to travel in the world.
Absolutely. And the aviation industry is constantly working to improve safety and develop new technologies to deal with turbulence now and in the future.
So the next time you're on a flight and feel a little bump, don't panic.
Yeah.
Just remember what we've talked about today and trust the system that's working to get you to your destination safely.
And, of course, keep that seatbelt fastened.
Great advice. Thanks for joining us on this turbulence deep dive. We hope you learned something and feel a little more at ease about flying.
Safe travels, everyone.